Chapter 2. The Southern Isles were not known for being a bastion of quiet. The 7 islands that made up the kingdom were, after all, located in the middle of a large expanse of sea. There were no mountains to hold back the howling winds and no sandy beaches to muffle the roaring surf. All the islands but one, where the king and his family made their home, were rocky. And at almost any point in the day, on almost any point of the islands, the air carried with it the strong odor of salt. The crown jewel of the Southern Isles was, of course, the king's palace. When people who had never been to the Southern Isles first saw the long, low walls stretching across the horizon, they often mistook it for a sea monster. The palace was made from the gleaming black rock that was found only in the Southern Isles. The only breaks in the stony outer walls were 4 large windows on the northern side, facing the kingdom's nearest neighbor. This made the palace nearly impregnable, but the result was a building that did, in fact, look like a serpent. The people who had been born and raised in the kingdom loved the castle and found it beautiful. They thought there was something empowering about the fact that it had managed to survive, even flourish, in such an inhospitable environment. But to Prince Hans, the youngest son of the king of the Southern Isles, the castle was ugly and awful. He hated it as much as he hated every inch of every island. To him, it did not matter that the sea provided the freshest harvest of fish, or that the hard island rock fetched high prices when carved into statues. To him, it didn't matter that his father was, as a result of all this, wealthy beyond imagination. To him, the Southern Isles and its castle were a prison, and his father the jailer. For the past 20 minutes, Hans had been standing outside the door to the castle's great hall, unwilling to make his entrance quite yet. The wind had stilled a bit as day turned to night. Usually, nothing could be heard over the whipping wind, and Hans was surprised at how clearly he could now make out the sounds coming from the other side of the door. He could hear his father's voice most clearly. It was impossible not to. The big man's voice was deep, his sentences clipped. The king did not waste words. To the point, Hans. Always just get to the point, he would say whenever he deemed Hans had stayed too long in his presence. Beneath his father's boom, Hans could hear the voices of his 12 older brothers. The sound was as familiar to him as the wind in the air or the smell of the salt, and often just as annoying. He had never known life without them. Every memory he had involved one or more of them, and not many of them were good memories. Hans took a deep breath. While he would have liked nothing more than to turn and walk away, he knew he had to at least make an appearance. His father had requested his presence, and when the king made a request, you did whatever was asked. In this particular case, that meant attending the last in a long line of dinners being held in honor of his mother's birthday. I'll just go in, say hello to father, and give my love to mother again, and then I'll be on my way, Hans thought. 5 minutes, no more. How bad can 5 minutes be? He shuddered. With his brothers, 5 minutes could be very, very bad. Taking a deep breath, Hans pushed open the door and stepped into the great hall. The room was lit by 1,000 candles, their flames making the room smoky and the air hard to breathe. At the front of the room, his father sat talking to his eldest brother, Caleb. The 2 men were engrossed in each other. Blatantly ignoring the women at their sides. The queen, Hans's mother, didn't seem bothered by it. She was, after all, used to it after nearly 30 years of marriage. She stared out over the room with glazed eyes as one hand stroked the large jewel hanging on her neck and the other held tightly to the stern of her wine glass. Seeing her son, she gave him a weak smile. Hans returned the smile before turning his attention to Caleb's wife. Unlike the queen, whose tranquility was impressive, the princess could not sit still. Almost 9 months pregnant with her second child, she fidgeted in her seat, glancing over at Caleb and then out of the tables before returning her gaze to Caleb. Her hands were in constant motion as well, resting on her belly for a moment before reaching for her wine glass and then thinking better of it. She looked painfully uncomfortable, and for one brief moment, Hans felt sorry for her. She's as out of place here as I am, he thought. She might as well be wallpaper the way Caleb is ignoring her. Well, at least father is kind to her, Hans acknowledged, some of his sympathy fading. The woman was carrying the king's future grandchild and would be treated accordingly. Just then, his father looked up from his conversation. His eyes landed on Hans, betraying no emotion. Nice of you to join us, he said. In the silence that followed, Hans could feel 12 pairs of eyes on him as his brothers finally took notice of him. Did you not think your mother's birthday worthy of your presence? I'm sorry, father, Hans said. Silently he added, but I don't seem to be missing much of a celebration. From what he could see, no one was even talking to his mother. This party was just for the sake of keeping up appearances. Politics. It was always politics with his father. It is not me you should be apologizing to, the king said. You should apologize to your mother. She is, after all, the only one who would have even noticed you were missing. Hans's face flushed red as the truth of the words hit home. He could hear a few of his brothers chuckle under their breath. Mumbling another apology, Hans quickly turned and made his way to a table at the back of the room. On his dais, the king turned his attention from Hans back to Caleb. How quickly I'm forgotten, Hans thought, watching the animated way his father talked to the eldest son. Hans wondered if Caleb even appreciated their father's attention. He was probably so used to it that he couldn't even imagine what Hans's life was like. Hans, on the other hand, constantly imagined what it would be like to be Caleb. The daydream never changed. He was his father's only son. His father adored him, and the two spent hours together. They would go hunting. Hans astride a giant chestnut stallion given to him on his 15th birthday. Beside him, his father would call out constant encouragement, and when they slew a wild boar, the king would boast at the feast to follow that only a son as grand and strong as Hans could have taken down such a powerful foe. When they weren't hunting, Hans would sit at his father's side as the king discussed political turmoil or made plans to invade enemy territory. Hans, his father would say, what did you do about the situation? I value your opinion above all. And Hans would answer him eloquently and with forethought, his words booming across the room and encouraging all those who listened. You are so wise, Hans, his father would say. What a lucky king I am to such a perfect heir to the throne. His daydream would usually end with his father bequeathing the kingdom to him. It is time, my son, the king would say. While you are still just a young man, I know you're ready to take my place as rightful king of the Southern Isles. I am so proud of you, my boy, so very, very proud. It was always at that moment that Hans would shake his head and the daydream would fade. He knew he was only fooling himself. No matter how many nights he spent watching the sunset over the Southern Isles, the kingdom would never be his. After all, he was the 13th son of 13 sons. He was worthless, a spare. He wasn't even a spare at this point. He was a throwaway. There was no scenario, no chance, no moment that would ever result in his being needed. As if on cue, he was a sharp pang as something hit him square on the back of his head. Whipping around, he saw the twins, Rudy and Bruno, standing behind him, laughing. Twins only in the sense they had shared the womb and had the same evil sensibilities. They were as physically different as night and day. Rudy was of average height, with reddish hair similar to Hans's. Bruno was freakishly tall, with freakishly blonde hair that stuck straight up. His pale eyes and paler eyebrows made him look perpetually shocked. What's the matter, little brother? Rudy asked, his tone cruel and just loud enough for their father to hear. Up in the dice, the king turned and looked over at his sons. Did you get a boo-boo? Bruno teased cruelly. Do you need to run to mommy and have her kiss it and make it all better? Hans clenched his fist, the temptation to retort strong. But after a lifetime of being the butt of endless taunting and teasing, he knew it was useless to fight, with words or fists. I'm fine, he said softly. What's that? Rudy asked, holding up a hand to his ear. We can't hear you. You really should learn how to speak up. Father abhors mice, don't you, father? He looked up at the king for approval. The Western Guards are lions, not mice, the king said, nodding. Hans, you should listen to your brothers. Maybe you could learn a thing or two from them if you stopped acting like you were better than them. Like sharks smelling blood in the water, a few more of Hans's brothers began to join in the teasing. After each well-placed jab, they would look to their father, eager to gain his approval even at the expense of their youngest brother. Hans sat silently, his eyes on the table. He noticed the way the wood was worn away in places, smooth to the touch, while in others it was jagged, as though the tree had just been pulled from the ground. He ran his finger over the splinters, grimacing, and they caught on his skin, but finding the pain oddly pleasant. Physical pain he could handle. Suddenly, Hans pushed himself to his feet and began to walk toward the door. He didn't care if his father would be mad later. It wasn't worth the torment to sit through any more of this assault. As he passed his twin brothers, he nodded politely but said nothing. Behind him, the twins muttered a few more insults but didn't bother to follow him. Stepping into the hall, he let out a deep breath. That could have gone a lot worse, he thought. At least they have thrown bread, not glassware this time. Turning, he made his way out of the castle and toward the sea. The dock was one of the farthest points from the Westergaard castle, which was part of its appeal for Hans. His brothers usually couldn't be bothered to walk all the way down there just to tease him, so it gave him a chance for the peace and quiet he craved. It also gave him time to think, something most of his brothers frankly couldn't care less about. All they cared about was their own reflections in the myriad of mirrors that lined the castle walls. It was well known that the Westergaard princes were, minus Bruno, a rather handsome bunch. At least in that way, Hans was like his brothers. He was tall, with golden red hair and big, inquisitive eyes. When he had turned 17 a few months before, he had begun to fill out. His shoulders were now broad and his arms strong from hours of practice with a sword. Prerequisite for a prince, even one who would most likely never see combat. Over the past few months, it had been growing more and more clear to Hans that despite his intelligence, despite his good looks, and despite his appreciation for the finer things in life, he had become of no consequence to his father. Caleb had married a few years before, and his wife had given birth to their first son soon after, which took a great deal of pressure off the remaining sons to produce heirs. It hadn't stopped some of them, of course. All of Hans's brothers, except the twins, were now married with children. Even the twins were courting, though Hans could not fathom who could possibly like either of those brutish thugs. And while he had heard the royal affairs coordinator discussing potential suitors for his brothers, Hans had not heard a peep about a possible wife for him. Hans shook his head, trying to rid himself of the negative thoughts that were invading his mind. He knew he was being maudlin for the sake of being maudlin. It wasn't as though he had woken up that morning to find out he was the youngest of 13 sons, with a distant and careless father. But that had been his life, always, and that would be his life forever. Nothing was going to change that, and the sooner he came to grips with it, the better.